Those that don't know me, my name's Nathan Finney. I'm president, as Michelle has said, of CCA. I farm in New Brunswick, just near the Nova Scotia border. We background on grass and a feedlot, and been with CCA now for 8 years. So, the opportunity that's been here has been greatly appreciated. And I've got a solid team here with me. I got three other gentlemen that are going to speak that are spread out across the country. So I do believe that we have from coast to coast fairly well covered. So with that, I'm going to jump in. Before we get into our committees that we're going to give you an update on what's going on, I wanted to give a little bit of an update on our environment advocacy campaign. We're in year 2 of 3, and we're really starting to see the momentum build in Ottawa from where it was prior to the campaign. Some of the messaging that was coming out of Ottawa, it's kind of done a complete 180, and we're getting some really strong messaging now. We're getting government to use the language like with the methane strategy. And then we have Minister Bibeau's remarks at our CCA reception in March. And the MPs are really liking our campaigning, asking for our resources. So now they're really starting to speak the language that we've been saying a lot of the time is, Canadian beef production is actually part of the solution for climate change. And one of the highlights was CCA's at our reception. Ducks Unlimited presented the first ever conservation award of distinction and awarded it to CRSB. So parliamentarians and industry stakeholders were present for the presentation of the award. So moving on now, we'll get into the Animal Health and Care Committee, and I will give a brief update on what's going on there. I'm sure you've all heard by now in the budget, we were finally glad to hear that our FMD vaccine bank has been approved, as well as funds for emergency preparedness. That's been an area where we've been advocating for a number of years. And finally, after all the work that's been put into it, we finally got that across the finish line. CCA has also updated our guidance for our guidance document for travelers who may be traveling to countries with FMD. So, to ensure that we're doing our part as we're, going around the globe on biosecurity and making sure. So I do ask, if you are traveling or know people that are traveling, please look for that guidance document. The long-awaited traceability regulations have been gazetted, and CCA will be thoroughly analyzing the text. We have been assured that it is consistent with the cattle implementation plan. We will also be seeking funding to assist in the additional investment cost required to implementation. Work is continuing on the risk assessment on potential changes to the Canadian specific risk material, SRM. The policies with the assessment expected to be completed later in 2023. And then finally, one of the other major ones in that committee that we're working on is the ELDs. We know how this is impacting transporters and stakeholders, and we've been really pushing to Transport Canada to see if we can get some flexibility, with the intention that we can get the alignment of US in the future. We're not asking for an exemption, we are asking for flexibility. And I think that is something that is achievable and would give our professional haulers a little bit more extra guidance and being able to move those cattle to where they need to be to finish destination. So with that, I'm going to introduce now our Vice President, Tyler Fulton, and he is going to give our domestic ag update. And Tyler, if you would please give just a brief update of where you are in the country and what you do.
You bet. Excuse me, I got a bit of a cold going here, but yeah, I'm Tyler Fulton. So I'm now the Vice President of CCA, and we operate a cow-calf and backgrounding operation in Western Manitoba, not far from the Saskatchewan border. This past year, I was actually served as the chair of the Domestic Ag Committee, and most recently, from our annual meeting just a few weeks ago, I wanted to just give you a quick quick highlight of what we've been working on. Another item, I guess, that came out of the federal budget that was quite positive for farmers at large was the changes to the advanced payments program. So what we saw is actually a move from 250,000 interest-free portion to 350,000 for this year. So especially given that interest rates have really spiked and are tightening margins for many operations, if there's ever been a time to really utilize that program, it's probably now. We are also advocating for some longer term permanent changes so that we can see some larger after this year, if nothing changes, that total amount that would be interest-free would revert back to the 100,000. And so we're going to work to advocate for some changes to match something closer to what we're benefiting from this year. On the livestock price insurance side, we continue to see this as a critical thing to advocate for. In particular, we're looking to make sure it's a national program for any of those regions that want to make use of it, including Nathan's region that worked through some pilot studies that try to determine the feasibility of maritime price insurance program. We want to make sure that it's permanent, that we don't that there's not a risk that we could lose this as a tool in managing our price risk. And of course, we'd also like to move to a more level playing field with our crop producing neighbors, which would make it a cost shared premiums in the same way that crop insurance has. Moving along onto the boxed beef price reporting, following a study on the competitiveness of the beef industry that was done largely focused on Alberta. CCA was one of the contributors to it, or the funders for it, but also includes Alberta beef producers and Alberta cattle feeders. It's as part of that study, we're focusing in on the feasibility of actually getting boxed beef price reporting. Now, we know that that's a critical feature to ensuring that we have really transparent price discovery mechanisms in place. And it's also part of that picture is also allowing us a better insight into what the sectoral margins are for each of the different segments of the beef supply chain. Lastly, I guess I'll touch on the industry government forage insurance task force, one that I've been directly involved with. Effectively, we led an initiative to bring together a whole bunch of provincial leads on forage insurance, as well as their federal counterparts, and as well as industry types. And so we thought in particular that with some of the technological developments and changes that have happened, in particular improvements in satellite imagery, that there was actually a lot of different projects that were happening where there wasn't a lot of information flowing back and forth from each of those projects, or even from one province to another. And so we thought that including everybody together and collaborating on what some of those key aspects are that make a successful forage insurance product would be a critical thing. So technology is one consideration. Also sales and extension support is another, and it's one that in some ways defines how successful the Americans have been with their range and forage insurance programs. So I think with the interest of trying to be brief, I'm gonna pass it along to Bob, where he'll, I think, talk a little bit about the environment file.
Thanks, Tyler. Welcome, everybody. I'm Bob Lowe. I'm the past president of the Canadian Cattle Association, and we have an operation in southwestern Alberta. Talk a little bit about the environment. I guess to start things off, Bill C-234, which is an act to amend the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. It'll exempt farmers from the carbon tax for on-farm fuel usage. This bill is passed through the House of Commons and is set for the Senate before it receives royal assent. We're very supportive of this bill and have been advocating along with other agriculture stakeholders for it to come to pass. The budget 2023 brought more money for SARPAL, which is a species at risk partnership with landowners and government. So we're pleased to hear that. CCA is also part of the Minister's Sustainable Agriculture Strategy Working Group, and we have submitted comments to help inform environmental programming and policies that will impact agriculture. And I'll add a little bit to Nathan's. Our Environmental Advocacy Act has not only been national, it has also proven to be very important internationally. We participated in the climate COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, and the biodiversity COP15 in Montreal. We were there, we were invited as part of the Canadian delegation, but we were also there as our own named delegation, which I think is fairly big on a global perspective. We have managed, with the help of not just CCA, but other organizations and other countries, we've moved the bar with the UN in how they view animal agriculture. So I think that move we started 2 years ago has been a huge, what would you call it, benefit to the cattle industry in Canada. And with that, I'll pass it back to Nathan.
Thanks, Bob. Food policy. The committee is shifting its attention towards lab-made protein, otherwise known as cellular protein. We're looking at regulations and in conversation with stakeholders and government as this product looks to come to market soon. The government of Canada is also developing a school food policy, which CCA submitted comments to and is part of an active discussions as this policy is further developed. And the government of Canada is shifting their attention towards food waste as part of their food policy files. And in that file, beef cattle play an important role in diverting food away from landfills, and we'll be looking for producers to get the recognition deserved on this effort. Also, public and stakeholder engagement is in the process of developing a documentary on food loss and beef cattle's role as upcyclers. We're looking forward to sharing this documentary with the public. And before we close out and open for questions, I will move it to Jack Chafe, who is our officer at large, to go over the foreign trade file.
Thanks, Nathan. For you that don't know me, Jack Chafe, live here in southwestern Ontario. We run a feedlot operation, and as well we run a cow-calf herd, and also backgrounding and finishing cattle in Western Canada. So as co-chair of Foreign Trade Committee this past year, lots of stuff going on there the last couple months, starting out with the proposed changes to the product of U.S. label, which would require all beef to come from cattle born, raised, and slaughtered, processed in the U.S. So any of that beef being processed there in the U.S. would have to be cattle that are born, raised, and slaughtered there. potentially could lead to similar impacts that we've seen when MCOOL came out. So we're looking at segregation, disintegration on imported cattle, and also maybe adding on to it could also affect grind and trim that our federal plants send south of the border. So we're keeping an eye on this. We're working with U.S. allies there, and put our comments in with the Canadian government to help rectify this. Moving on to the UK session into the TPP agreement. Basically, Canada and other countries have allowed this to forecome. At the same time, none of the beef industry's concerns have been addressed with the UK, and CCA is opposing the legislation required for Canada to move this forward through the House unless we get our concerns addressed through a bilateral agreement. So currently working on that, and maybe just to give you some trade figures there, in the last year, we shipped zero amount of pounds of beef, and coming back into Canada from the UK, we took in 27 million. So definitely an imbalance in trade there. Moving on to Bill C-282, which is a private member's bill. And what that is basically ensuring that supply management products cannot be negotiated in any further trade deals. So with that, we're working with CAFTA to make sure our voice is heard, trying to get this slowed down in the House. Currently, it's in front of the Trade Committee, but it has passed first and second readings, so it's moving quite quickly. So lots of tactics going on there to slow that down. And then maybe finishing up with imports of breeding cattle coming in into Canada here. Over the last couple of years, we've had a real slowdown on paperwork on getting those cattle approved and be able to move them into Canada here on a timely fashion. So working on that to get those approvals speeded up. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Michelle.